down, on prey, onward gaining ground. Glory, hallelujah, the dead's alive and the lost is found. Glory, hallelujah.
Welcome back to Eschatology Matters on the Fight Laugh Feast Network. I'm your host, Josh Howard, and I'm joined today by a brother pastor up in Canada from a confessional church, so I'm looking forward to this conversation. But first, Boniface Media is a streaming platform from Grace and Truth Press. Boniface is right now offering 50% off to 200 subscribers for the life of their subscription, unless that subscription is canceled or their payment lapses. So if you'd like to take advantage of this offer, head over to boniface.com, that's BONAFICE.com, and enter the codes Alpha Test or Beta Test to apply your 50% discount. I'm joined today by Pastor Matt Plett out of Canada. So Matt, thanks so much for joining me today.
Good to be on with you, Josh.
I'd like to point out, people have made fun before of me having the classically reformed backdrop. I have the bookshelves. I have all the, the studious books that I've been, at least appearing to read, if not actually reading. But you have a deer head, plaid, and a wood stove, which is like 3,000% more manly than my setup. So good on you, Matt.
I could have put Turretin and Bovink on the wood stove here for you if you would prefer, but and I have read Turretin.
There you go. Yeah, don't put them on the wood stove; they might burst into flame.
Yeah.
But yeah, Matt, you reached out. You've seen the show. You reached out to me. Lot to talk about, but little introduction. Where are you at? What are you up to? And how'd you find Eschatology Matters?
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure. I think just basically in the web of podcasts I listened to, came across your own, and a lot of the stuff you touch on, whether it be, issues related directly to eschatology or covenant theology, some of the hermeneutical issues with God's law, and some of that I find interesting. And so I'm a dairy farmer by profession. And so the nature of the work I do, lots of being in the barn on the tractor, I'm fortunate that way. I'm able to listen to a lot of media. And so I actually did the math. I listened to about 38 hours a week of media that I'm able to do in the tractor and in the barn. So it's that part is, I'm quite thankful for technology. And so, yeah, I appreciate a lot of the work that's being put into podcasts like this and others as well. It's a great way to learn. And I often think about, what it was like, 60, 70 years ago to be my grandpa milking cows in the barn. What would he think if you realize you can listen to the best preachers in the world by Sunday afternoon? You've got all their sermons on your phone and you can just listen while you're doing your work. It's
no kidding, man. It's a huge blessing.
Sure. No, I don't take it for granted. I'm quite thankful if I think of the blessing that the technology can provide.
Matt, you're pastoring in Canada. I did the map work a minute ago, but where are you pastoring at in Canada? How long you been doing it? What sort of church are you at? What's all that look like for you?
Right. Yeah. So I'm pastoring a Reformed Baptist church. We're a confessional 1689 Reformed Baptist church, just south of Winnipeg, Manitoba. Winnipeg's our capital city, kind of in the southeast of Manitoba. For your American audience, that would put us about 3.5 hours straight north of Fargo, North Dakota. If you just keep going on I-29, it turns into Highway 75 here once you hit the Canadian border. And so we're basically right along there. Planted a church there with some others, I guess about 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, would have been spring of 2022. And the Lord has blessed it. It's been great seeing who He's all sent our way and the continued growth we've had both quantitatively and qualitatively. It's been great.
Perfect. So Matt, we were talking a little bit before. I wish we would have just recorded the whole thing because we were getting to catch up and hear a little bit about your ministry. But I'm curious what pastoring in Canada looks like right now. So we've got one brother who's also on the Fight Laugh Feast Network. He's across the border, a little on the other side from you. But Canada's seen a little bit different, I think, in the last 4 years than the United States has. I think a lot of American Christians, from what it sounds like, we may have thought things were a little sunnier in Canada post-COVID than they got immediately. I'm pastoring in Michigan. I know we came here in the summer of 21 and things were very much not normal yet in a lot of ways. What's that looked like for you guys? How has it been, especially planning a church? Like how has that looked kind of in the Canadian environment right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think geographically where we are, isn't a great microcosm of Canada. We would be and we can get into that later. On the surface, it would seem like we live in a relatively conservative area. There's a heavy concentration of Mennonites that settled this area. So we've got, I grew up in that kind of culture and that kind of world here in southeastern Manitoba, heavily Mennonite, lots of Christian families. The municipality which I live in, which would be like our equivalent of your counties, had the youngest age of marriage in Canada and the highest marriage rate in Canada a number of years ago. I don't know if that's still the case. So we're somewhat insulated culturally from the rest of Canada. Canada as a whole would be probably very analogous to, maybe to California or to Massachusetts or something along those lines. Culturally, Canada has become very liberal, although we do have a shared Protestant history with the United States. Of course, you go back far enough, a lot of the history and the kind of English Protestant tradition is there, and it's there in our legal documents. It's there in our history, but certainly the acid of secularism has eroded much of what was able to shape the culture and the customs and the laws of this nation. And it seems to be in the last number of years, probably that's accelerated. Certainly in pockets of Canada.
Okay. Yeah. That's about, I mean, and that's, I think a lot of times, obviously the locale, like, you mentioned municipality, but the states there in Canada, same as the states here. Michigan is a far different animal than even Indiana we see crossing across the border. Do you guys, by the way, do you see much of the Ezra Institute and those actions? Nathaniel Wright was the brother I was speaking of that's over toward the other way, but do you guys see much of their work in that area?
Yeah, I've been following a lot of the Ezra Institute's work, for a number of years. Actually ran into Joe Boot, had lunch with Joe Boot in Moscow in 2018 when I was down there for the Grace Agenda. Was pretty impressed with the talks he gave at the Grace Agenda, and then bought a copy of The Mission of God. Thought it was so good, actually, for our men's theology night after we started Trinity, where I'm pastoring now. That was the book we did for our men's theology night, and quite impressive that, a bunch of men, a room full of 30 men going through a 700-page tome like that. Man. But it was really great. You break it down to small enough pieces, and so I'm quite appreciative of the work that Dr. Boot has done. He's actually also a Whitfield guy, so there's that connection there as well. But then some of the other guys that have kind of taken up the mantle there as well, quite appreciative for their work.
Okay. No, so you're working, and one of the things I want to push in on is, you mentioned the kind of conservative Mennonite environment in which you guys have planted a church, and I'm curious what that looks like. You're in a Reformed church. You're a confessional 1689 church. From what I gather, you guys are an accommodating Reformed church. You're reaching out to a lot of like-minded Christians who maybe aren't exactly where you guys are. I'll let you fill in all the gaps on anything I'm saying here. But what's that like in a Mennonite area in Canada in 2024? What does that look like trying to reach out to, especially trying to pull together Christians? One of the things, and I don't know if you get this sense, but I think you'd mentioned it on your email when we'd first connected, was speaking of kind of refugee Christian culture. I sense more of that now, and again, I'm 40, so I have a limited scope on things, but I sense more of that now than in previous generations. I think within the United States that Christians who in the past may not have thought very much about their geographic relationship to other Christians or what town they live in, finding a church was more of a, that was like the third or fourth down the list type thing when they were moving somewhere. I get the sense that now Christians are starting to think of themselves a little more refugee. They're looking around, especially if they're in a hard to reach area, like you mentioned, California or even Michigan, some areas of Michigan. What's that been like for you, encountering that, and how has that gone in a Mennonite area? Has that been a help or a hindrance?
Yeah, realistically, probably both. And I think what you just suggested is true. It's been my suspicion for a number of years, and that's probably only accelerated in the last several, is that the way the church generally is organizing itself tends to be more along the lines of liberal and conservative rather than, former ethnic markers. Where I live in Manitoba, and Canada generally is probably a lot less of a melting pot than the U.S. So where I live, it was when I was a kid very clearly defined. You had French communities, and you had Mennonite communities, and you had Ukrainian communities, and you had German communities. And so the church was very much organized by, French Catholic, Mennonite. In the Ukrainian towns, of course, you've got an Orthodox church, maybe a Ukrainian Catholic church as well. You see the onion domes, the stereotypical Lutheran church, and some of these German communities and Icelandic communities a little further north in Manitoba, real Scandinavian presence there. And so that's just the history of who settled here and how they came. And a lot of those communities, even into my childhood, very much had that identity. And to some degree, that's still the case. But I think what we're seeing is, suddenly a conservative Baptist and a conservative Lutheran see we've actually got more in common than I do inside my own denomination with other Baptists or other Lutherans. And so there seems to be some mobilization of Christians reorganizing themselves more along kind of liberal conservative identifiers rather than denominational or kind of historical or ethnic identifiers. And so with that, there's good and there's bad that comes with that. Growing up in the Mennonite tradition, I want to speak charitably and yet honestly, but one thing that you knew about Reformed Christians was that they were entirely unconcerned about sanctification. They may be Christians, maybe, but they knew far too much. There was far too much theology, and so I think there is largely a lack of understanding, probably both theologically and historically, of other traditions that didn't exist inside the Mennonite stream of history. And so for me, becoming Reformed first in my soteriology, 20-ish years ago, maybe not quite, was quite a stretch. And I remember I had a history teacher in grade 8, wonderful man. I loved him a lot, but he had mentioned the Reformation era as we were going through world history, and he mentioned the Calvinists, and he said, those are people who want to call themselves Christians but still live like the devil. And of course, impressionable grade 8 kid, that I just took that, and as I was discovering, actually, it was through through some different issues regarding the emerging church and also about female ordination that a fire was lit under me to start studying theology. And having conservative instincts, I kind of gravitated towards finding certain things about the emerging church and about gender stuff from John Piper. And then I found, John MacArthur, R.C. Sproul, and some of this stuff. And I found them to be really, really great on the inerrancy of the Bible and on doctrine generally. But then it got to this soteriology stuff. I'm like, how could they be so far off on that? And of course, as I studied it further, I came to realize how biblical that was and how much my own view was shaped by tradition rather than directly drinking from the scriptures. So there's been some of that to overcome. And we've seen Christians from other traditions, Trinity, we've got people that have come from Presbyterian churches, Anglican churches, a large contingent of Mennonite, different forms of Dutch Reformed, some non-denominational. People have come from all over the place. And, I've joked with some other pastors that kind of are in a similar spot. We've got a network of Reformed Baptist pastors that meet together periodically. And one of them described his church, and I'd say it was the same for us, especially at the beginning. He said half the people are here for the Reformed theology, and the other half don't know what a Reformed theology is.
Nice.
They're just here because they want expository verse by verse preaching. They just want none of the fluff. Just get down to business, preach the word. And so they were there for expository preaching, for conservative theology, and they discovered Reformed theology, and that would be very much our origin story as well. Some of the people came because of the Reformed theology. Some of the people were just tired of the, whether it was the wokeness or the lack of seriousness or the low view of corporate worship that became evident during COVID and some of that stuff. Some of those disruptions got people thinking. It was a blessing and a curse. A lot of people started listening to Voddie Baucham, and they start listening to R.C. Sproul, and they start listening to other stuff on the web, Joe Boot, and you realize, oh, there's more out there than what I'm used to. There's this whole vast world. And so that did create a certain appetite in people to see that there is more out there than maybe what they were accustomed to.
Yeah. Yeah. That was definitely an interesting time when people, because there's always, the risks and the cons to watching online sermons and to reaching out there. You can find some garbage, but a lot of people found good stuff. The same way I think a lot of parents, obviously a lot of parents were confronted when they saw their kids doing school online and they were like, this is what my kid's learning. And whether they pulled them into homeschool or whether they just confronted school boards, there was a lot of that churn. I think you got that with theology as well, obviously. I'm curious. So, and before we move ahead, what would be sort of the majority opinion on eschatology among a Mennonite populace? And I'm thinking pre-mill, but I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth. Is this somewhat homogenous, or is it a pretty good blend? What does that look like?
I would say relatively homogenous. It's not something that was discussed much at all that I recall. I think it was pretty low on the list of priorities from my recollection. And yet that said, historically, Anabaptists, well, it depends how far back you want to go. If you want to go to the earliest Anabaptists, like the European Anabaptists at the time of the Radical Reformation, were actually kind of apocalyptic premillennial types. Like if you've heard of the Munster Rebellion, they were bringing in the kingdom of God by force through violence, actually, in Munster, Germany. And some of the real radicals like Jan Bokeljan and Jan Matisse, some of the disciples of Melchior Huffman. So there was a real, actually violent revolutionary fervor that was deeply connected to what we would today call premillennialism. That was there. Now, that said, actually, in one of these violent Anabaptist revolts that happened in the Netherlands, Peter Simons, the brother to Menno Simons, after whom the Mennonites are now named, died in one of those revolts, kind of as a revolutionary. And Menno Simons himself figured this can't be the way. And so he was, to some degree, kind of a father figure that the Mennonites badly, badly needed, or that the Anabaptists badly needed. And he brought some maturity and some seriousness to the group. Certainly not a perfect man by any stretch, but he did bring some seriousness and some gravity that they much needed, and moved them into the pacifist position that Mennonites today are known for, just because of how violent some of this kind of left-wing revolutionary stuff had gotten in Europe. And with that, I would say, since Menno Simons, the majority report among Mennonites is actually a form of amillennialism, and a very kind of radical two-kingdom form of amillennialism, of course, which fits with the pacifism, right? The kingdom of this world is viewed very dimly. Christians should not be involved in civic affairs really at all, even to the point of voting. In my community, a number of the older people didn't even vote, because even that was too much engagement in civics. And certainly to hold any kind of office or to be a police officer involved in the military was seen as worldly. That's the world, the kingdom of the world. Christians must eschew that altogether. So it's actually even a more radical form of two kingdoms theology than what you might see from a Tim Keller or a Michael Horton or a David Van Drunen. It's much more radical than that yet. And of course, that's called radical two kingdom theology, and this would be well past that yet. And so amillennialism is kind of a good fit with that, kind of maybe a bit of an agnostic, or probably maybe even a little bit of a gloomy outlook on the future, that the world is just going to burn up. The physical world doesn't really matter. It's burning up, so why would you bother getting involved in those affairs? What really matters, it is kind of a form of pietism, where what really matters is getting your soul saved, getting it out of here, because everything's just going to burn up. That this world is essentially discarded, at least certainly the way we know it.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear you give that kind of encapsulation of it, because you'll hear in some modern back and forths within American evangelicalism, you'll hear the term Anabaptist thrown around, not exactly as a smear or anything, but somebody will say that's Anabaptist to somebody who's not an actual Anabaptist. You know what I mean? Trying to, especially with eschatological or two kingdom issues, and usually the pushback is a very defensive posture. But that sort of view that you just laid out, aside from the like pacifism from like voting booths and stuff like that, a lot of what you just described, I think, is alive and well within a lot of large pockets of evangelical Christianity that would not describe themselves as Anabaptist nor Mennonite within America. Have you noticed that as well?
Yeah, for sure. There is discussion that has happened historically, and it's not necessarily a cut and dried issue. To what degree is there overlap or relationship between the Baptists and the Anabaptists? I would largely say, in the Reformed Baptist world, is very much two different orbits, very much so. But Anabaptism has certainly been successful in exporting some of its doctrines into the wider evangelical and Protestant world. A certain view, of course, in the older Protestant tradition, there is a form of separation between church and state, of course, but the more radical separation of church and state is, I think, a product of Anabaptism that has been exported, and certain views of the sacraments and certain views of baptism. So I say that even as a Reformed Credo Baptist, in a confessional Credo Baptist, the understanding of what's happening at baptism is quite different in the Anabaptist world versus in the Baptist world, right? There's very much a bare memorial view of the sacraments that comes through quite strongly in the Anabaptist world. Nothing is happening here
Right.
other than these elements help us to remember something that happened, but there's no grace being conveyed. Talking about the spiritual presence or so forth, or means of grace, even to call them sacraments was never an issue. It's bare memorials, whereas even practicing believers' baptism, there's different understandings between different Credo Baptist practices between the Baptists and the Anabaptists.
Yeah.
But there is historical record that John Smythe in Great Britain did have some contact with Menno Simons, and so there is some cross-pollination between those worlds that is there historically. I think that's only fair to acknowledge.
Yeah, no, that's good. So I'm wondering, I'm just going to throw you right into the fire on this one, Matt. But you're a postmillennial Reformed Baptist pastor. I hope I haven't busted you out on this one. But how do you present any sort of what does that look like to interact with those who are coming out of a let's just assume for the moment out of a sort of radical two kingdom amillennial strict bifurcation of the heavenly and the earthly, the spiritual and the worldly. How do you start to communicate? Because this is the typical pushback you'll see, at least from online discussions and a lot of interactions face to face from people. The usual assumption is I can look around, I can see that things are not good. I would suspect Christians in Canada might have some cause to look around at times and say darkness seems to be on the rise or things look bad out there. And then you're coming in with a vision of not only is Christ reclaiming all things to himself and conquering every enemy under his feet, but it's also a kingdom that is being established in this world. What does that conversation look like for you?
Well, the key thing you learn is to be patient. With a lot of those things, whether it's a Reformed understanding of how we're saved, the order of salvation, let's say. Was I convinced of that in 15 minutes? No, I was not. It took me probably a year and a half of reading a lot of stuff and fighting it almost the entire way. And so the challenge with, and I was a lot younger then, one of the challenges with being a younger man is impatience. And, I did 2 years of hard reading and lots of listening to sermons to get to this position. But now that me and you are talking, you need to get there in the next 7 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
or else, right? And I don't think that's a healthy or sanctified attitude at all. Paradigm changes take time. And actually, before I started farming, I worked somewhat in the sales world as a nutrition advisor for a feed company here, actually working in dairy nutrition and undergoing a lot of sales training. And one of the things I learned at one workshop in particular that was helpful for me is to recognize just basic human behavior. Pushing people for a decision on the spot rarely works. And the kind of people, let's say if you're selling something and you can sell them on what you're talking about in 10 minutes, that's actually not the kind of person you necessarily want, because if you could convince them in 5 minutes, it probably wasn't a particularly thoughtful progress that they made. The next person could come along and persuade them of something different in the next
Right.
5 minutes. So to me, it's actually a good sign if people are a little bit cautious and thoughtful before just making major paradigm changes, right? So you don't want to be the guy that undergoes a major theological crisis every 7 years. I don't think that's healthy. But you also don't want to be the guy that prides himself and I've never changed my mind on a single issue in the last 25 years. I think we should operate somewhere between those two things. In terms of the, if you want to move it to the eschatological paradigm, I think to be an optimist in your eschatology in this day and age in this country, you have to be truly persuaded by the text of Scripture, because the newspaper headlines will not lead you in that direction.
Right.
Right. So I would want it to be very much exegetical arguments, theological arguments that I'm making, not, I don't rush to the historical arguments, like, look how much better it is now than it was 500 years ago. Even that's objectively true. I just don't go there, because the time frame most people think in isn't in hundreds of years, it's in my lifetime, which is very short, right? And in my lifetime, things have not gotten better by many metrics. And so I would not want to go to the experiential argument at all. I'd want to take it to the exegetical arguments. Some of the ones that I personally found compelling, probably the most compelling, was actually the New Testament use of Old Testament scripture, particularly God's favorite Bible verse, which is Psalm 110:1. I realized this is a passage of scripture that is used in the New Testament like no other, just in terms of force and clarity and explaining it further, and in frequency. This is a major theme that Christ, the Lord, says to my Lord, right? That sit at my right hand until I make all your enemies a footstool. So the ascended Christ as he currently is at the right hand of the Father until all his enemies have been made his footstool. So his enemies will be made his footstool before he returns. And 1 Corinthians 15 clarifies the timeline on that quite clearly. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. Whereas in most of the other paradigms, certainly in premillennialism, you'd have to say the first enemy to be destroyed is death at their understanding of the first resurrection. And I realized it was one of those things that you grow up never hearing about this, never thinking about it, and then it becomes so obvious. It's almost borderline frustrating at certain points, right? Like, this is a major theme in the New Testament is Psalm 110:1. Psalm 2 is used almost as frequently as Psalm 110:1. Jesus' kingdom parables clearly show slow but steady progress and victory through history. And so I'd say that would be probably the most compelling arguments I found was the New Testament use of the Psalms. 1 Corinthians 15 I found compelling. Jesus' kingdom parables in Matthew 13 I found to be persuasive. And so those would typically be the places I would go to. I don't start with the book of Revelation, for example. I would take a preterist reading, and I think that in terms of, if we think of the original audience, that makes the most sense to me would be that particular reading of the Olivet Discourse and Revelation. But I wouldn't start there, because I think Revelation is a notoriously difficult book. So I would say you should have your eschatology hammered out before you even touch Revelation. Your eschatology should start in Genesis chapter 1, and what you do with Revelation should be the icing on the cake.
That's it.
But if someone could prove to me a late date for Revelation and that it absolutely cannot be a preterist reading, my eschatology actually would be unadjusted because of that. My reading of Revelation, of course, would have to be adjusted, but my understanding of world history would not change, because and I'm assuming you'd share this view too. To me, eschatology isn't just about future things. It's about an overall reading of history starting in Genesis 1.
Yep.
What are God's plans for this universe? What's the story arc of history? How is God glorifying his name through all of history from eternity past to eternity future?
Yep. No, that's I completely echo everything you were just saying. I'm about to start yes and amening you like you're preaching or something, because that's been part of our goal with Eschatology Matters, has been not only a whole Bible eschatology, like a sense of story, a sense of narrative, but also, as you said, not that Revelation is unimportant, but while recognizing its difficulty and its kind of consummating icing on the cake kind of status there, or at least placement there, is that your eschatology builds. I mean, for me, one of the most formative portions of eschatology was Christ's statements about the kingdom in the Gospels, his statements about defeating the strong man in the Gospels. And then you get into the Pauline letters, and like you said, 1 Corinthians 15, where you get, I know a lot of people will try to kind of sandwich that into like that all actually happens in 1 minute time span, but that's not how Paul's laying it out, and that's certainly not how the psalmist is laying that out. This is a steady progression that begins with Christ's ascension. He is seated, he is reigning, his enemies are being defeated in front of him. So yeah, I agree with you there from the exegetical standpoint, which is a refreshing take, because typically how eschatology, at least postmillennial eschatology, gets critiqued is that it kind of waxes and wanes with the newspaper headlines. That the typical way it's introduced in seminary courses and in half the textbooks on my shelf is that, well, it was a really popular thing until the world wars came, and then everybody abandoned it because, of course, everybody is swayed by the winds and waves of this world. And now it's becoming popular. And then it kind of trails off a little bit, the argument there, because I don't know that anybody would say it's on the rise because things look real cheery outside. That does not seem to match. I think it must be an exegetical drive, right?
I think so too. Yeah, I'd agree with you. And I agree. I mean, in one Sunday school series that I was part of, not as a teacher, but as a student, probably in my early to mid 20s, the views were all laid out, and it was a revelation study, but then the four various, eschatological positions were laid out, dispensational premillennialism and the more historic form of premillennialism, amillennialism, postmillennialism. And that was just kind of an afterthought. Yeah. Can you believe people thought this before World War I?
Yep.
And basically dismissed out of hand. And I understand, especially the liberal turn that a lot of the mainline denominations took, and they kept their optimistic eschatology, but now it's with the social gospel. I understand the negative reaction historically, why the 1900s tended to dismiss that particular version of eschatology. And yet, if people are interested in the history of it, it's one of those things now, it's so old, it's new again. Sometimes I find it helpful to go back and just, let's do a survey of church history before the 1900s. How did Athanasius see the world? How did Augustine see the world? How does Calvin himself talk about the progress of the gospel? How did the Puritans see this? And suddenly you realize, no, this isn't some fringe camp. This is a very mainstream position. In fact, before the 1900s, to be a conservative evangelical was to hold some form of inaugurated eschatology or some form of optimistic eschatology, right? And a lot of people are surprised to hear even Spurgeon speak about, well, of course, heaven is going to be far bigger than hell by the time things are consummated, right? B.B. Warfield and Hodge and the Princeton men, Archibald Alexander, and these men were uniformly optimistic. John Murray, in their eschatological positions, even a lot of the Baptists, right? John Gill is clear on this issue, and a lot of others that came after him, Isaac Backus, James P. Boyce, and John Broadus, who established Southern Seminary, where Al Mohler is president now. I mean, this was almost a uniform position. Certainly, I mean, in the Church Father days, of course, you have more variety, but from the Reformation on through the Puritan age, up until the World Wars, this was maybe not hammered out in every detail, but overall, the ethos of evangelical Christianity, certainly the conservative form, was to have a more optimistic view of where things are headed, and that's clear in Baptist history as well. That's not just to one segment or one stream of history. This was a mainstream view, and I think I'm personally okay with it making a comeback. And I think you're right. It would have to be based on exegetical arguments, because I don't think we can look around and say, oh, look at how much Christianity has advanced in the last 10 years in North America. I don't think that's the argument to make.
Right. Yeah. And I agree with you. I think it's always it's a compelling thing to look around. And, I always bring up the example of my cell phone, the fact that I can pull up any number of Bible resources on my phone. I can pull up hundreds of translations. I can pull up Greek and Hebrew, language helps on my phone. Like just that little, thing it's a tremendous blessing of God's kingdom expanding. But like, again, I'm not going to, like you said, build my eschatology based on I have really good phone apps. It is part of the outgrowth of God's kingdom, but I think there's an exegetical case to make. I'll throw one name in there, by the way. I think Augustine sounds incredibly optimistic in some of his writings.
I'd agree.
Yeah, that one to me is there's some fruit there for somebody to explore that has more time. I'm curious.
Sorry, yeah, no, go ahead.
Yeah.
I was just going to say the only difficulty with the fathers is they didn't speak in the millennial language that we are accustomed to having this discussion in now. So it's not so easy to categorize the fathers as pre-mill, all-mill, post-mill, because they weren't speaking in those terms.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And that's one of the frustrating things I think with talking with people that are making those historical arguments from the fathers is you can read the reformers, and the reformers are clearly dealing with things in their day. They're using language in specific ways. You got the same thing with the church fathers, and they're just quite simply they're not there to hash out premillennialism versus like that's not on the radar. So to grab a quote and say, aha, he mentions kingdom.
Yeah.
It doesn't quite prove as much as you might
No,
think.
they were dealing with issues of Christology and Trinitarianism in their day, and that's what consumed almost all their resources. At the Reformation, of course, was about justification. And so you can always see what the high priority issues of the day are, and it was not eschatology.
Right.
Whereas by the Puritan era, it's very much once you're discovering a new country, establishing law and so forth, it becomes much more of a top of mind issue. How does God's law apply? It's more of a top of mind issue in the last 400 years, let's say, than it may have been before that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. For my favorite illustration about that is to read, you can read John Calvin in his commentaries and quickly ascertain like what is the battle of the day, what is kind of on the front burner, because you'll have a passage, you'll have 3 paragraphs of commentary on it, then you'll have 7 paragraphs ranting about the papists and all of their abuses. It's just like this that you can tell what the conflict of the day was focused on. Matt, I'm wondering one last thing, because I don't want to keep you too long, but I'm wondering one last thing, just insofar as, so you're describing a two-kingdom theology that is radical beyond what I would probably consider radical, right? Like you've kind of laid out, this is a very separate two-kingdom sort of theology. How do you communicate to people that are coming out of that mindset, or maybe even still in that mindset, whether they're Christian or maybe whether you're witnessing, but how do you communicate to people God's kingdom touching down in this world? Is that something that's a huge impediment? Is that something that you're kind of, obviously you're patient, you've laid that out, right? You're going to be patient with those paradigm shifts, but is that something you are regularly confronted with on the front end of your efforts, or is that more something that kind of comes down the line in church work and in sanctification and teaching?
Yeah, that's a great question to consider. I think you've got this probably a common feature in human nature, where there's such a strong paradigm that you've been taught or instructed in that it's there, and yet instinctively you see the holes with it, right? So growing up at Mennonite, for example, pacifism was very much the official position. Don't get involved in any of these affairs. What happens with the law doesn't really affect us, and so forth. And people would know that answer, and yet instinctively, I remember when same-sex so-called marriage got legalized in Canada, suddenly Mennonites who were radical two kingdom were writing letters about what a travesty this was.
Interesting.
And so there's just instinctive. It doesn't work in the real world to hold that two kingdom theology in that way, because instinctively we know we want righteous laws and not ungodly laws, right? And even the most radical two kingdom people know instinctively, I think because they're made in the image of God, and I think because there's enough familiarity even with Scripture, that there's difficulty with that tradition. And it's easy to hold a radical view like that in a world in which the Anglicans and the Presbyterians and the Baptists have all come, set up just weights and measures, set up law courts, set up a law tradition that honors God, that, even our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is far from perfect, starts with the supremacy of God, right? Canada's a parliamentary monarchy.
Mm-hmm.
So the head of state in Canada is King Charles, and he had to make a vow, as his mother had to make, to advance the gospel throughout the realm, right? So it's in the DNA of Canada just as much, and maybe actually even more explicitly in the English law tradition than in America, of these explicitly Christian roots. And so in that environment, if that's the ethos around you, and you're leaving communist Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution, it looks pretty good. And it seems plausible that that this version of two kingdom theology could be plausible because you're moving into an environment that you're surrounded by other Christians who are keeping things safe and stable and who are engaging in civics, who are engaging in political theology and social theology, thinking through the cultural issues, how as Henry Van Til noted, that culture is just religion externalized. So if you're living in that ethos, it seems plausible. Well, we're just going to have our separate communities. In German, the Mennonites talk about being the Stille im Land, the quiet in the land. We will just have our communities. We will build our churches. We will raise our families. We're going to farm to the glory of God, and we're not going to worry about anything around us. And of course, the history of Mennonites is leaving Switzerland for that reason, leaving the Netherlands for that reason. And then you go to Prussia. And once things turn there, well, where do we go now? Well, we go to Russia. We go to the Black Sea, right? And things turn bad there. Well, where do we go? Well, we go to Canada. And things start looking not so good in Canada. And we've had a great migration of Mennonites to South America. But it's a constant trail of moving when the Christian consensus leaves, because there's really nothing to say. There's nothing to do other than leave. Fighting certainly isn't an option. Getting engaged in cultural formation or in the arts or in the legal world isn't such an option. So it's one of those things that there is a certain irony there that this only works if you're surrounded by Christians who think quite differently than you do, right? And you could say the same about even the Reformed kind of radical two kingdoms. If you're living in California in a leather professor's chair, it's easy to talk about this neutral sphere that was created by people who think quite differently from you. But there's few things that are shown to be more obviously false in our day, in my mind, than that there's a neutral moral consensus. If you live in an age where you don't even agree on how many genders there are, there is no neutrality. Right? It's got to be Christ all the way down. And that means you have to think through seriously. What does it mean when Jesus says before the Great Commission, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me? What does that mean on earth? What does it mean? And this is actually an interesting point too, if we're thinking about the intersection with Mennonite theology. Menno Simons is helpful a character as he was in Anabaptist development, actually denied the real humanity of Jesus Christ. He held to a form of Docetism, which makes sense. And I don't think his Christology drove his two kingdom theology. I think the two kingdom theology was driving the Christology. This world is so corrupt that even Jesus Christ didn't have real flesh. He had heavenly flesh. He did not inherit humanity from his mother. That's how dim a view of the physical world has typically been taken in those circles. And yet, if you think through, what does it mean that Jesus was incarnated as a man? He was resurrected in the flesh, and he was ascended to heaven in the flesh. Certainly, physical creation is not one of the things that God just created to throw away, because Jesus himself was resurrected and ascended with a physical body after taking a physical body. And so that radical bifurcation or that radical separation of the physical world from the spiritual world, I just don't see how it's plausible. And being in those circles, that was causing increasing discomfort for me, was the disengagement from the real world. Right? We'll worry about the kind of the spiritual things, the unseen things, and we'll leave the real world to non-Christians, because the real world doesn't really matter anyway. It's all burning up. God's going to discard it. It is a form of retreatism or escapism, or certainly can feed that. And so it's a significant paradigm shift. But if you just work through some of these things, and thankfully after Menno Simons, basically no one that I know of held his view on the heavenly flesh of Jesus. Most Mennonites after him have been orthodox on that point and held to the true humanity of Jesus. But once you start making some of those connections, no, Jesus was an actual person in an actual world. What does it mean that Christ has been given all authority in heaven and on earth? People tend to be receptive to those exegetical arguments because I will say one benefit of working in kind of in this area with many people who have grown up in that background is there is a great familiarity actually with the Bible. There's not a strong emphasis on putting the pieces together or doing the theological work, but there is a strong culture of reading the Bible, understanding the Bible, knowing the stories, and so you're not starting from scratch. I sometimes liken it to it's like all the puzzle pieces are there. You just a lot of people, they just need to see the box cover to see what they need to do with these pieces. But the pieces are all there. And if you can show them how the picture can look, you're not starting at zero. You're starting with significant Bible knowledge, typically in this area. And the task then is to show how the pieces fit. And for the most part, I'd say people are fairly receptive to that. Of course, some as is human nature, get a little apprehensive or a little bit defensive when there's tradition and what you've been taught as a child comes into play. But for the most part, the biblical knowledge is there that you can make some of those cases rather convincingly, in my experience.
Yeah, no, that's so encouraging because we've talked we've talked about that a lot. How, at least in America, a lot of the reaction to some of the recent years has been that it's better that cultural vestiges of Christianity, it's better that they go away. It's better that they recede. In essence, it's better if we just have true Christianity and rank paganism on the other side. But what you're describing, I think, is so compelling, even or especially for nominal Christians or cultural Christians or however we want to describe that, is just to consider they know the stories, they've got kind of some of the building blocks or puzzle pieces, like you said, and then just helping them to put those things together by the work of the Spirit, obviously, but still helping them put those things together of why did Christ take on flesh and why was he raised in the flesh, and what does that mean for us? Paul's drawing out something a whole lot bigger than we might grasp there in 1 Corinthians 15 again. That's like the third reference, by the way, to 1 Corinthians 15. Everybody should read that chapter far more, but it gives you such hope, doesn't it, of God's purposes for this world, that this world is not some evil thing he's going to throw away, nor is your flesh even, but because Christ was raised, we too shall be raised. That's I'm encouraged, Matt. I'm just encouraged to get to know you a little bit and to hear the work that you guys are doing in Canada, because I think oftentimes for Christians, especially if they've grown up, as many in our day and age have, in convenient environs in the United States where it has been convenient to be a Christian, it could be quite a black pill to look around and say, oh, things look quite dark and there's no hope. What you're describing, though, is a hopeful patience, right? You mentioned hopeful eschatology, but also a patient eschatology. I think it's what's supposed to drive us right now. And whether they have all their eschatological ducks in a row, that we have a patience with what God is doing and that we use those means through which he's given us. So anyway, Matt, it's been a pleasure, man. Thank you so much for hopping on, and maybe we can follow up sometime and talk about deer hunting or something like that. Sure.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to do that. And no, it's been good. I appreciate the work you're doing on having these discussions. I appreciate it that, on your podcast, the different views are represented and you're having these conversations and trying to charitably build some consensus in the kind of the conservative Christian world on some of this stuff. And I've appreciated your work, and may the Lord continue to bless that. And who knows, maybe we will get consensus on this issue down the road.
I appreciate those kind words. Yeah, that's the prayer. Is our hope has been for more consensus, and at least where there are dividing lines to have clarity, and not to have people just lobbing, as we discussed earlier, maybe lobbing some uncharitable mischaracterizations across the bow, but instead to know where each other stand, to encourage each other in those regards. But yeah, Matt, thank you so much, man. This has been a pleasure today, brother.
Thank you. Yeah, no, appreciate it, Josh.
At my right hand, the Lord to my Lord did command, for of these heathen I will make King